December 18, 1944, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. Corporal Warner W. Holzinger pressed his cheek against the frozen metal of his M1 57mm anti-tank gun, watching the tree line through breath that crystallized instantly in the sub-zero air. The fog was lifting, too fast, revealing the positions of the 2nd Battalion, 99th Infantry Division scattered along the ridge. Behind him, the sounds of hasty entrenchment, shovels striking frozen ground, officers barking coordinates, the metallic click of ammunition being stacked within arm's reach. Through his sight, Holzinger spotted movement. Not the tentative probing of reconnaissance, but the deliberate advance of something massive. The ground trembled before the shapes materialized, dark, angular silhouettes emerging from the white mist like prehistoric beasts. Panzer Furs. Then, behind them, the broader, more menacing profiles of Panthers. An entire column, perhaps 20 vehicles grinding forward with the confidence of an army that had smashed through the Ardennes for 3 straight days. Column formation, Holzinger muttered to his loader, Private Jackson. They're not even deployed for combat. The tactical manual was explicit. Engage the lead vehicle, disable it to block the road, then shift fire to the rear to prevent retreat. Standard anti-armor doctrine, taught at every artillery school from Fort Sill to the front. Holzinger had spent 6 months learning it, practicing it, internalizing it until it became reflex. But staring at that column, buttoned up, moving fast, commanders confident enough to keep hatches closed, Holzinger saw something the manual writers hadn't anticipated. A pattern, a rhythm, a sequence that violated every principle he'd been taught, yet made terrible, perfect sense. He made a decision that would either save the ridge or get him court-martialed. Probably both. The anti-tank doctrine that governed American artillery tactics in late 1944 was born from hard lessons paid for in North African sand and Italian mud. The principles were clear, logical, and proven. Concentrate fire on the most dangerous immediate threat, create obstacles to channel enemy movement, conserve ammunition for sustained engagement. The purpose of anti-tank defense is denial of terrain. Red Field Manual 6-135, employment of anti-tank artillery. The anti-tank gun crew must prioritize targets based on immediate tactical threat and munitions conservation. Brigadier General Bruce Clark, commanding the 7th Armored Division's Combat Command B, had articulated the philosophy succinctly in a November 1944 briefing. We stop their lead elements, we force them to deploy, we make them pay for every yard. That's how you defend against armor, methodically, by the book. The doctrine had worked. At Mortain in August, American anti-tank crews had shattered the German counteroffensive by destroying lead vehicles, creating traffic jams that made the following panzers easy prey for tank destroyers and fighter bombers. At Aachen in October, similar tactics had bled entire panzer battalions white against prepared defenses. For the crews of the 99th Division's anti-tank companies, hurriedly deployed to Elsenborn Ridge as the Battle of the Bulge exploded across the front. The manual represented not just tactical guidance but survival itself. They were facing the largest German offensive in the West since 1940, spearheaded by the best-equipped panzer divisions the Wehrmacht could still field. Stick to the fundamentals, Captain Robert Kriz had told his gun crews the night before. Lead vehicle, rear vehicle, work the middle. Don't get fancy. The Krauts are good, but we're better if we follow doctrine. The confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. American anti-tank crews were well-trained, their guns were reliable if outranged by German armor, and the defensive positions along Elsenborn Ridge offered excellent fields of fire. The 99th had already bloodied several German probes during the first days of the offensive. But doctrine assumes certain battlefield conditions. dispersed enemy formations, adequate crew survivability to engage multiple targets, time to adjust fire based on initial results. The German column approaching Holzinger's position on the morning of December 18th met none of those assumptions. Intelligence reports from Doctrine SS Panzer Corps prisoners revealed the German confidence. Kampfgruppe commanders, racing to maintain the offensive's momentum, were pushing armored columns forward with minimal reconnaissance, trusting in speed and shock to overwhelm American defenses still reeling from the initial assault. "They think we're broken," Lieutenant Edward Miller had observed during the pre-dawn briefing. "They're moving like they own the roads." For Warner Holzinger, watching that panzer column advance in tight formation, the German overconfidence created an opportunity the manual had never contemplated. But exploiting it meant abandoning everything he'd been taught about proper anti-tank engagement. The question was whether his unorthodox idea would be vindication or suicide. The American anti-tank doctrine Holzinger was about to violate had evolved through 2 years of combat against the most armor-centric military in history. It began in the disaster of Kasserine Pass. In February 1943, when Erwin Rommel's panzers shattered unprepared American units in Tunisia, the U.S. Army learned brutal lessons about anti-armor warfare. Early doctrine, based on WWII static defense concepts, proved catastrophically inadequate against blitzkrieg tactics. Anti-tank crews that held positions too long were bypassed and destroyed. Those that engaged at maximum range exhausted ammunition before inflicting critical damage. The Army's response was systematic. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox conducted extensive trials throughout 1943, testing British, Soviet, and captured German anti-tank tactics. They analyzed after-action reports from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. They interviewed survivors of panzer attacks to understand what worked and what got you killed. The resulting doctrine, codified in multiple field manuals between late 1943 and mid-1944, emphasized several key principles. Target priority, engage the most immediate threat first. Lead vehicles blocking narrow approaches, command tanks identifiable by extra antennas, and vehicles carrying infantry that could assault gun positions. The logic was survival. Neutralize what can kill you now, worry about the rest later. Ammunition conservation. Every crew carried limited ammunition. The M1 57mm gun, standard equipment for infantry division anti-tank companies, held 12 rounds ready and another 24 nearby. Against a determined panzer assault, running dry meant abandoning the position or dying behind a useless gun. Mutual support. Anti-tank guns operated in pairs or sections with overlapping fields of fire. When one gun engaged, others provided covering fire or engaged different targets. No gun crew fought alone if doctrine was properly applied. Fire discipline. Gunners were trained to wait for optimal range, typically 800 yards or less for the 57mm, where penetration was assured. Shooting at maximum range wasted ammunition and revealed positions to enemy armor that could return more effective fire. Warner Holzinger had absorbed all of this at the anti-tank artillery school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he'd trained for 3 months in early 1944. The instructors, many of them North Africa veterans, hammered home the doctrine with the fervor of men who'd seen too many crews die from improvisation. The manual's written in blood, Master Sergeant Frank DeLuca had told Holzinger's class. Every line represents some poor bastard who learned the hard way. You follow it, you live, you get creative, you die. Simple as that. Holzinger had been a good student. His gunnery scores placed him in the top 15% of his class. He could identify German armor by silhouette at 1-200 yards, calculate deflection for moving targets in his head, and strip his gun blindfolded. When he shipped to Europe with the 99th Division in October 1944, he was confident in his training and doctrine. But doctrine assumed your enemy fought the same way every time. The German Panzer tactics of late 1944 were not those of 1940 or even 1943. Fuel shortages, crew attrition, and desperate strategic circumstances had forced modifications. Rather than the dispersed combined arms advances that had characterized earlier blitzkrieg operations, German armor in the Ardennes often moved in tight road columns to conserve fuel and maintain speed. This made them vulnerable to air attack during daylight, which is why the offensive had been timed to exploit bad weather. But it also created a tactical situation American anti-tank crews had rarely encountered: enemy armor advancing in formation, vehicles close together, speeds high enough that standard engagement doctrine, methodical, sequential target elimination, might not work before the column closed to assault range. Lieutenant Miller had noticed this during reconnaissance reports from the first 2 days of the battle. "They're bunched up," he'd told Captain Kriz. "Not like the tactical show, more like a traffic jam in combat." Kriz had nodded. "Then we hit the lead vehicles harder, block them in place, let the tank destroyers and artillery work over the jam." It was sound thinking based on proven doctrine. But it assumed the enemy would react predictably. Stop, deploy, assess, attack. What if they didn't? What if they simply rolled over the obstruction, accepting losses to maintain momentum? Holzinger had been thinking about this problem since Elsenborn Ridge came under pressure. His position, Gun 3 of Baker Battery, covered a crucial approach, a dirt road that offered one of the few routes through the forested ridgeline. Intelligence suggested German armor would come this way, and the terrain favored defense. Narrow road, steep embankments, limited maneuver space. But that same terrain that channeled enemy movement also meant a destroyed lead vehicle might not block the road effectively. Panthers could push through moderate obstacles. If the column kept coming, a single gun crew engaging by the book might knock out 2, maybe 3 vehicles before being overrun. So Holzinger began thinking about alternatives. What if you didn't start at the front? What if you disrupted the formation itself, created chaos in the middle of the column where commanders couldn't see clearly, where following vehicles couldn't judge whether to advance or retreat? It was the kind of tactical speculation every soldier engages in during quiet moments, the mental rehearsal of combat that keeps you sharp. Most of it never gets tested. But on the morning of December 18th, when that Panzer column emerged from the fog in perfect road formation, Holzinger's speculation became decision. "Jackson," he said quietly to his loader, "we're going to do something different." Through the 57mm sight, the column resolved into individual vehicles with terrifying clarity. Holzinger counted quickly. Lead Panzer IV, 3 more behind it, then 5 Panthers, then more Panzer IVs stretching back into the morning mist. 20 vehicles minimum, probably more, all buttoned up, all moving at 15 miles per hour, commanders confident enough to keep hatches closed in what they believed was penetrated American territory. The rangefinder read 100 yards, still long for the 57mm, but closing fast. By doctrine, he should wait until 800 yards, then engage the lead Panzer IV with armor-piercing rounds until it died or he did. Instead, Holzinger traversed right, tracking past the lead vehicles. "Warner, what are you doing?" Jackson's voice was tight. "The leader's going to be on us in 3 minutes. Counting." Holzinger kept traversing. 1 Panzer to 4, 2, 3, 4. The Panthers started. 1, 2, 3. 4th Panther, larger than the others, 2 antennas visible even with hatches down. command tank. Load AP. Holzinger's voice was steady despite his heart hammering against his ribs. Jackson slammed the armor-piercing round home. Range? Doesn't matter. Just keep loading. The doctrinal part of Holzinger's brain was screaming. The lead Panzer IV was now at 950 yards. In another 30 seconds it would be an optimal killing range, and he'd have lost the initiative. Every instructor at Fort Sill would be calling him a suicidal idiot. But Holzinger had seen something those instructors hadn't. This wasn't a deployed armor formation expecting resistance. This was a road march in combat zone, vehicles so close together that the 3rd Panzer IV was only 50 yards behind the 2nd. When you shoot, you don't just affect your target, you affect everything around it. The command Panther crossed into his sight picture. Range, 1,020 yards. Not ideal, but the 57mm could penetrate a Panther's side armor at this distance, and the column's angle gave him a perfect flank shot. On the way. Holzinger squeezed the firing lever. The gun bucked. The breech flew open, ejecting the spent casing in a shower of brass and cordite smoke. Jackson already had the next round moving. Holzinger didn't wait to confirm the hit. Load! Load! The second round slammed home. He'd already traversed forward, tracking to the 3rd Panther. On the way. Fire. Load. The rhythm was faster than Doctrine allowed, faster than you were supposed to shoot when you needed to conserve ammunition and confirm kills. But Holzinger wasn't trying to kill tanks in sequence. He was trying to destroy the column's coherence. 3rd shot. 2nd Panther. 4th shot. 1st Panther. 5th shot. The 4th Panzer IV behind the lead group. 5 rounds in 45 seconds. The manual called this wasteful. The manual said you needed to observe each impact, assess damage, adjust fire. The manual said a lot of things that assumed you were fighting the last war. Through the smoke of his own firing, Holzinger saw his plan working, or failing spectacularly. The command Panther had stopped, smoke boiling from its engine deck. His first shot had been lucky, penetrating into the engine compartment. The 3rd Panther was slewing sideways, crew possibly killed or panicking, blocking the road completely. The 2nd Panther showed no obvious damage, but had also stopped, and the 4th Panzer IV, his 5th shot, had been hit in the track assembly. It wasn't dead, but it couldn't move forward, and it sat directly behind the first 3 Panzer IVs, which were still advancing but now without support from the main body. The column, so confident and compact 30 seconds ago, had become chaos. 6. Jackson shoved another round into the breech. We got 8 ready left. Now Holzinger violated Doctrine again. Instead of engaging the stopped Panthers, confirmed threats that needed finishing, he traversed forward to the lead Panzer IV. It was at 720 yards now, accelerating. The commander had clearly realized they were under fire and was trying to rush the American position before his supporting armor could be destroyed. On the way. The 6th round caught the lead Panzer IV in the turret ring. Not a kill shot. The armor was thickest there, but it damaged the traverse mechanism. The turret locked in place, main gun pointing uselessly 30 degrees off target. Holzinger traversed to the 2nd Panzer IV. 7th shot, track hit, vehicle slewing left into the embankment. 3rd Panzer IV, 4th shot, clean miss, round sailing over the turret. Cursing, he adjusted. 4 rounds. Jackson was counting like a man watching his life expectancy shrink. 8th shot, 3rd Panzer IV, penetration through the side armor. Fire erupted immediately, ammunition cook-off. The Panzer IV became an instant pyre, black smoke belching skyward. Behind him, Holzinger heard Lieutenant Miller's voice, distant and disbelieving. "Gun 3, report. What the hell are you shooting at?" No time to answer. The 4th Panzer IV was traversing its gun toward his position. Holzinger could see the 75mm barrel swinging, the commander's hatch popping open as the German crew prepared to engage with direct observation. 9th shot. He aimed for the open hatch. The round missed the hatch, but caught the commander as he emerged, the impact throwing the man backward into the turret in a spray of red. The vehicle stopped immediately, crew either dead or abandoning ship. 2 rounds ready. Jackson's voice was nearly a shout, but something miraculous was happening down on the road. The entire panzer column had stopped, not just the vehicles Holzinger had hit, but all of them. Hatches were opening as commanders tried to understand what was happening. The Panthers, in the middle of the formation, were trying to traverse turrets, but with vehicles stopped front and back, they had no clear fields of fire. And at 850 yards, Holzinger could see movement that made his chest tighten with savage satisfaction. Infantry dismounting. German grenadiers who'd been riding on the Panther's engine decks now scrambling for cover in the ditches. They thought they were being ambushed. They thought they'd run into a prepared defense with multiple guns, maybe a company's worth of anti-tank weapons. The rapid fire, the targets scattered through the column rather than concentrated at the front, the apparent precision of the shots, all of it suggested a deliberate killing ground rather than one desperate crew improvising. "Gun 3, cease fire." Miller's voice was clearer now, the lieutenant running toward the position. "Save your ammunition." Holzinger ignored him for 5 more seconds. He traversed back to the Panthers, aimed at the command tank sitting dead in the road, and fired his 10th shot. The round punched through the already damaged engine deck and detonated something internal. The entire vehicle lifted slightly on its suspension, then settled as secondary explosions rippled through the hull. 11th shot, he shifted to a Panther that was trying to reverse, its commander backing down the column in the only maneuver available. The range was increasing, 100 yards now, but Holzinger led the target perfectly. The round caught the reversing Panther in the rear armor, the thinnest section. It didn't penetrate entirely, but the impact damaged the transmission. The Panther stopped, smoke leaking from its engine grates. "1 round." Jackson sounded like he was announcing the apocalypse. "Hold it." Holzinger lifted his eye from the sight, surveying the scene. The road was a junkyard. 4 vehicles definitely destroyed or disabled in the forward section, 3 more stopped in the middle with visible damage, and the entire rear of the column backing up or trying to deploy off the road into terrain that couldn't support their weight. Panthers were nosing into ditches, tracks spinning in mud, drivers discovering too late that the approaches to the ridge were less forgiving than they looked. Miller reached the gun position, breathing hard, face red with cold and exertion and anger. "Corporal, did you hear my order to—" He stopped, finally looking at what Holzinger had been shooting at. The lieutenant's expression cycled through confusion, comprehension, and something that might have been awe. He raised his binoculars, scanning the column, doing the math that Holzinger had done instinctively. "You shot through the middle of the formation," Miller said slowly. "Yes, sir." "You engaged the command vehicle first." "Yes, sir." "You fired 12 rounds in how long?" 90 seconds, maybe less." Holzinger was feeling the adrenaline drain now, replaced by exhaustion and the sudden fear that he'd just destroyed his military career. "Sir, I know the Doctrine says—" "Fuck the Doctrine." Miller was still staring through the binoculars. "Corporal, you just stopped an entire panzer column with 1 gun." Down on the road, the chaos was intensifying. American artillery was beginning to find the range, 105mm shells screaming in now that the column had stopped moving and presented a stationary target. Fighter bombers would follow as soon as the weather cleared. The Panthers and Panzer Huirs that could move were trying to reverse out of the killing ground, but vehicles stuck in ditches or damaged by Holzinger's fire blocked the retreat. From positions along the ridge that Holzinger couldn't see, other American anti-tank guns were engaging now, picking off targets with the methodical precision that Doctrine demanded. But they were shooting at a stopped, disorganized column, not a combat formation. Holzinger's unauthorized firing pattern had transformed a dangerous armored thrust into a target array. Captain Kriz arrived 10 minutes later, after the shooting had mostly stopped and the Germans were abandoning vehicles or retreating on foot. He looked at Gun 3, at the 12 spent casings scattered around the position, at the scope of destruction visible on the road below. "Lieutenant Miller's report says you disobeyed Doctrine," Kriz said carefully. Holzinger stood at attention, ready for whatever came next. "Yes, sir." "He also says you saved the ridge." Kriz paused. "Maybe save the entire defensive line." "I just saw a pattern, sir. The way they were moving, all bunched up, confident. I thought if I hit them in the middle instead of the front, they'd think they were surrounded." Kriz nodded slowly. "That's not in any manual I've read." "No, sir. We're going to have to write a report about this, probably several reports. The brass are going to want to understand what you did and why it worked." Kriz almost smiled. "I'm thinking that report might take a while to finish, weeks even, by which time you'll probably have earned a decoration rather than a court-martial." Holzinger didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. "Get this gun cleaned and rearmed," Kriz ordered. "I have a feeling the Germans are going to try this road again. Next time, we'll have more than one crew waiting, and next time, Corporal, we'll do it your way." The engagement at Elsenborn Ridge on December 18, 1944, might have remained an interesting footnote, one corporal's lucky improvisation during a desperate battle. Instead, it became something more significant, a case study in how doctrine must evolve when battlefield conditions outpace training. Within 48 hours, Holzinger's unauthorized firing pattern was being discussed at battalion and division headquarters. Captain Kriz's after-action report, filed on December 20th, described the engagement in detail and included a tactical assessment that challenged conventional anti-armor doctrine. The engagement demonstrated that against column formations moving in restricted terrain, traditional target priority may be counterproductive, Kriz wrote. By engaging vehicles throughout the formation, rather than concentrating on lead elements, Corporal Holzinger created the impression of a coordinated ambush, resulting in enemy paralysis and withdrawal without our position being seriously threatened. The report circulated quickly. First Army Headquarters, desperate for any tactical success stories as the Battle of the Bulge raged, seized on the engagement as proof that American troops could adapt and overcome German armor tactics. By December 23rd, elements of Holzinger's approach were being incorporated into hasty briefings for other anti-tank units facing similar threats. But adaptation wasn't universal or systematic. Military doctrine doesn't change overnight, especially during active combat operations. Throughout the remainder of the Ardennes campaign, American anti-tank crews employed a mixture of standard doctrine and improvisation, with results that varied dramatically based on terrain, crew training, and enemy tactics. American evolution. The debate over doctrine. At Fort Knox's Armored School, training officers were divided. Major Charles Thompson, chief instructor for anti-tank tactics, argued that Holzinger's success was situational, the product of specific terrain, enemy overconfidence, and exceptional individual skill that couldn't be replicated by average crews. "We can't train every gunner to abandon fundamental principles on instinct," Thompson wrote in a January 1945 memo. What Corporal Holzinger accomplished was remarkable, but it required judgment that develops only through combat experience. For newly trained crews, standard doctrine provides the survival foundation they need. Others disagreed. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Harkins, attached to Naudicine Corps headquarters, argued that the Battle of the Bulge had revealed German tactical desperation that created new vulnerabilities. The enemy is moving in ways that violate their own doctrine because they must maintain operational tempo, Harkins observed. When armor advances in tight column formation, we should exploit that vulnerability rather than engage them as if they were properly deployed. Holzinger understood this instinctively. We need to teach it systematically. The compromise emerged in February 1945, codified in a supplement to FM 6-135. The new guidance didn't replace existing doctrine but added conditional applications. When enemy armor advances in column formation with minimal deployment, crews may consider engaging targets throughout the formation to create confusion and halt momentum. This approach requires exceptional gunnery skill and should be attempted only when A. Terrain restricts enemy maneuver, B. Ammunition supply is adequate, and C. Crew survival is assured by positioning or support elements. It was bureaucratic language, careful and qualified, but it represented something significant: official recognition that rigid doctrine could be as dangerous as no doctrine at all. German adaptation, learning from defeat. German armored units facing American defenses in the Ardennes learned their own bitter lessons. Intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations from late December 1944 revealed that German tactical doctrine was itself evolving under pressure. Oberst Hans Joachim Kahler, commanding a Kampfgruppe in the 12th SS Panzer Division, was captured on December 28th after his formation was decimated in similar circumstances to the Elsenborn engagement. His interrogation report, filed on January 2, 1945, provided insight into how the Germans were reassessing their own tactics. "We were ordered to maintain speed at all costs," Kahler stated. "The operational plan depended on reaching the Meuse before American reserves could deploy. This meant accepting risks we would not normally take: tight formations, inadequate reconnaissance, movement during periods of enemy observation." When asked about the specific engagement that led to his capture, Kahler described a scenario remarkably similar to Holzinger's victory: a road column ambushed by what initially appeared to be minimal opposition, but which created disproportionate disruption. "The American gun engaged throughout our formation," Kahler explained. "My initial assessment was that we faced a company-strength defensive position with excellent coordination. By the time I understood it was perhaps only one or two guns, we had already lost momentum and cohesion. Infantry had dismounted, vehicles were blocking each other, and American artillery had found our range." The lesson wasn't lost on German commanders. By late December, surviving panzer units were implementing modified movement procedures: wider vehicle spacing when terrain permitted, more aggressive reconnaissance, and orders to continue advancing even under fire unless facing demonstrable, overwhelming opposition. But these adaptations came too late and required resources the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. Fuel shortages made dispersed formations impractical. Crew losses meant fewer experienced commanders who could make rapid tactical decisions. And American air superiority, once the weather cleared after December 23rd, made any armor movement during daylight suicidal regardless of formation. The psychological dimension. Perhaps more significant than tactical modifications was the psychological impact of engagements like Holzinger's. For American troops, the victory at Elsenborn Ridge, and others like it, proved that German armor could be stopped, that individual initiative could defeat superior equipment, that adaptation mattered as much as firepower. Sergeant James McCarty, serving with the 2nd Infantry Division, described the shift in morale in a letter home dated January 5, 1945. Word spread about what one gun crew did to a whole Panzer column. It made you think different about things. Before, you saw those German tanks and you felt outgunned, outclassed. After, you started looking for their mistakes instead of your disadvantages. Maybe that's what changed in the Bulge. We stopped being afraid and started being mean. For German forces, the reverse was true. The confidence that had characterized the offensive's opening days, when it seemed American lines might collapse entirely, eroded as tactical assumptions proved false. American troops weren't broken, American defenses weren't paper-thin, and American adaptability was turning German desperation into German defeat. Lieutenant Friedrich Vogel, a Panther commander captured on January 12, 1945, expressed the German perspective in his interrogation. By late December, we no longer trusted the roads. We no longer trusted our formations. Every approach felt like ambush. The Americans were fighting differently than they had in France, more flexibly, more aggressively, perhaps because they were defending their own lines rather than advancing, or perhaps because they had finally learned how to fight us. To understand the full significance of Holzinger's firing pattern, we must distinguish between tactical vindication and doctrinal revolution. The Elsenborn engagement represented peak effectiveness of individual adaptation, one soldier recognizing a fleeting opportunity and exploiting it perfectly. But it did not represent a new doctrine, nor could it, the statistical reality. Between December 16, 1944, and January 25, 1945, American forces in the Ardennes destroyed or disabled approximately 600 German armored vehicles. Of these, perhaps 50 were destroyed in circumstances similar to Holzinger's engagement. Column formations ambushed through unconventional firing patterns that prioritized disruption over methodical target elimination. 50 vehicles from one tactical innovation, 600 total from comprehensive defensive operations employing combined arms, artillery, air power, and, yes, traditional anti-tank doctrine applied by thousands of crews who followed their training and survived. The numbers suggest what military historians have long understood. Exceptional circumstances produce exceptional results, but doctrine exists to ensure baseline competence across average circumstances. Colonel Trevor Dupuy, in his post-war analysis, The Military History of the Battle of the Bulge, noted, Warner Holzinger's action at Elsenborn represents the apex of individual tactical initiative. But the German offensive was defeated not by individual brilliance, though such brilliance certainly helped, but by systematic application of combined arms defense, logistical superiority, and operational flexibility at division and corps level. When innovation failed. Not every attempt to replicate Holzinger's success ended well. On December 27, 1944, another 57mm crew from the 106th Infantry Division attempted a similar engagement against a German column near St. Vith. Corporal Dennis O'Brien, apparently inspired by reports of the Elsenborn engagement, opened fire on the middle of a Panzer formation. Unlike Holzinger's target, this German column was already alert to American positions. Unlike Holzinger, O'Brien was firing from a position with limited cover and no supporting guns nearby. The result was predictable and tragic. The German column deployed immediately, identified O'Brien's position within seconds, and destroyed Gun 4 with direct tank fire. O'Brien and his entire crew were killed. Captain William Dennison's after-action report was blunt. CPL O'Brien displayed courage but not judgment. The tactical situation bore no resemblance to those where unconventional engagement patterns might succeed. His crew died attempting innovation where doctrine would have provided survival. Such failures didn't negate Holzinger's achievement, but they illustrated why militaries are conservative about doctrine. Innovation requires understanding not just what worked once, but why it worked and when it might work again. That level of tactical judgment comes from experience most soldiers never survive long enough to develop. The vindication for Warner Holzinger. Personally, vindication came in multiple forms. On January 15, 1945, he was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy on 18th of December 1944 near Elsenborn, Belgium. When a superior enemy armored force threatened to break through American defensive positions, Corporal Holzinger, demonstrating exceptional tactical judgment and gunnery skill, engaged the enemy throughout their formation, creating confusion and halting their advance. His actions resulted in the destruction of multiple enemy vehicles and contributed significantly to the successful defense of vital terrain." More meaningful to Holzinger was the respect of his fellow soldiers. Crews from throughout the 99th Division sought his advice on anti-tank tactics. Officers consulted him when planning defensive positions. He was promoted to sergeant in February 1945 and survived the war to become an instructor at Fort Sill, where he taught anti-tank tactics until his retirement in 1962. In interviews conducted decades later, Holzinger remained humble about his achievement. "I got lucky," he told historian Stephen Ambrose in 1988. "Right terrain, right target, right moment. Another day, another situation, I might have died following that same instinct. That's combat. You make the best guess you can and hope mathematics favors you." The doctrinal legacy, post-war analysis of American anti-tank operations in World War II produced mixed conclusions about Holzinger's innovation. The official Army history, published in 1951, devoted 3 paragraphs to the Elsenborn engagement and concluded, "While individual tactical innovation demonstrated value in specific circumstances, overall anti-tank effectiveness depended primarily on proper positioning, combined arms coordination, and adherence to fundamental gunnery principles." Yet, the engagement never disappeared from military education. At Fort Sill, Fort Knox, and eventually at the Armor School at Fort Benning, instructors used Holzinger's firing pattern as a case study in tactical flexibility. Not as doctrine to replace existing methods, but as an example of why soldiers must understand the principles underlying doctrine, so they can recognize when circumstances demand adaptation. Lieutenant General James Gavin, writing in 1958's War and Peace in the Space Age, cited Holzinger specifically, "The soldier who understands why he fights a certain way can adapt when conditions change. The soldier who merely memorizes procedures becomes helpless when those procedures no longer apply." Holzinger didn't abandon his training. He applied its underlying logic to unprecedented circumstances. This became increasingly important as armored warfare evolved through the Cold War. Tank tactics in Korea, doctrine development for potential conflict in Europe, and eventually the mechanized operations of the Gulf War all grappled with the same fundamental tension: how to maintain doctrinal consistency while encouraging tactical adaptation. The Israeli Defense Forces, studying American anti-tank operations in the 1950s, incorporated Holzinger's principles into their own training. During the 1967 Six-Day War, Israeli anti-tank teams successfully employed similar disruption tactics against Egyptian armored columns, engaging vehicles throughout formations to create confusion rather than methodically eliminating lead elements. 78 years after Warner Holzinger squeezed that first unauthorized trigger, his firing pattern endures as teaching metaphor rather than tactical doctrine, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The fundamental lesson of December 18, 1944, wasn't about where to aim or when to fire. It was about the relationship between doctrine and judgment, between training and adaptation, between following orders and achieving objectives. Holzinger succeeded not because he ignored his training, but because he understood it deeply enough to recognize when its underlying assumptions no longer applied. Modern military education continues to grapple with this balance. At the Army's Command and General Staff College, Holzinger's engagement appears in coursework on tactical decision-making. Students analyze not just what he did, but the cognitive process that led to his decision. What pattern did he recognize? What assumptions did he challenge? What risks did he accept, and why? The answers matter because warfare continues to evolve faster than doctrine can follow. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces repeatedly encountered tactical situations their training hadn't anticipated: improvised explosive devices, urban warfare against irregular forces, counterinsurgency operations that blurred lines between combat and constabulary action. Success required the same quality Holzinger demonstrated: understanding principles deeply enough to adapt them creatively, the human element. Perhaps most significantly, Holzinger's story reminds us that military effectiveness ultimately depends on individual soldiers making critical decisions under impossible pressure. All the doctrine, technology, and firepower in the world cannot replace human judgment at the moment of decision. When asked in 1992 what he wanted people to understand about his actions at Elsenborn Ridge, the elderly Holzinger was characteristically modest. "I was terrified. I thought I might be throwing away my life and my crew's lives on a wild idea, but I looked at that situation and thought, the book doesn't cover this. So I wrote my own page. That's all any soldier can do when the enemy doesn't cooperate with your training manual." That one gun crew, firing 12 unauthorized rounds in 90 seconds, stopped a Panzer column and helped hold a ridge that anchored the northern shoulder of the Bulge. In doing so, Warner Holzinger didn't revolutionize warfare. He simply proved what the best soldiers have always known: doctrine guides you to the fight, but judgment wins it. The final irony is that Holzinger's firing pattern, now taught at military schools worldwide as an example of tactical innovation, has become its own kind of doctrine. A reminder that the most important military principle might be knowing when to set principles aside. On Elsenborn Ridge today, a small memorial marks the defensive positions where American troops stopped the German advance. Warner Holzinger's name appears among hundreds of others who fought there. No special notation identifies his singular contribution. Perhaps that, too, is fitting. Individual brilliance matters most when it serves collective purpose. The gun crew that saved a ridge, the ridge that anchored a line, the line that stopped an offensive, the offensive whose failure hastened a war's end. One gunner's unauthorized decision, rippling forward through history in ways he never imagined when he pressed his frozen cheek against that gun sight and chose to aim where doctrine said he shouldn't.